He thought humiliating her would entertain the crowd, but within minutes, the entire room would wish they had stayed silent. The golden chandeliers of the Whitmore Grand Hall cast a warm glow across polished marble floors, reflecting the quiet prestige of an evening reserved for the city's elite, where tailored suits and silk gowns whispered status without a single word being spoken. And at the center of it all stood Daniel Hayes, the celebrated violinist whose name alone could sell out a 1,000-seat auditorium in under an hour. His presence commanding the stage long before he even lifted his instrument. His confident smile met with polite applause as he adjusted the cuff of his custom jacket, every movement practiced, deliberate, admired, and unquestioned, because in this room, he was not just a performer, he was authority itself, and no one came here expecting to question him, least of all someone like Clara Whitmore, who moved quietly along the edge of the stage with a simple cart of cleaning supplies, her plain gray uniform blending into the background as if she had mastered the art of invisibility, her hair tied neatly at the back, her posture straight but unassuming, the kind of presence people noticed only long enough to dismiss. And tonight was no different, as guests sipped their drinks and exchanged polite laughter, their eyes sliding past her without interest, unaware that the silence she carried was not emptiness, but control, because Clara had long ago learned that the less you revealed, the more power you kept hidden, and yet, fate had a way of dragging the quiet into the spotlight, especially when arrogance demanded an audience. And Daniel Hayes, basking in the admiration of the room, let his gaze drift across the stage until it landed on her, a flicker of amusement crossing his face as if he had just discovered an unexpected prop in his perfectly curated performance. And in that moment, the air shifted ever so slightly, subtle enough that most didn't notice, but heavy enough that something irreversible had just been set in motion, because men like Daniel didn't just perform music, they performed power, and power, when mixed with pride, often sought a target. His lips curling into a half-smile as he leaned toward the microphone, his voice smooth, confident, carrying effortlessly across the hall as conversations faded into silence, every head turning toward him, waiting, expecting brilliance, and what they received instead was something else entirely, something quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous, as his eyes remained fixed on Clara, who had paused mid-step, her hand resting lightly on the edge of her cart, her expression unreadable, her eyes steady, not defiant, not fearful, just present, as if she had seen moments like this before, as if she already knew how it would end. And for a brief second, something in Daniel hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty that vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the comfort of control, because in a room like this, he had never once been challenged, never once been wrong, and certainly never been outplayed, and the audience, eager for entertainment, leaned forward without realizing they were about to witness something far beyond what they had paid for, because this was no longer just a performance. This was a setup, a quiet collision between arrogance and restraint, and somewhere beneath the soft hum of anticipation, the night began to shift, the kind of shift that doesn't announce itself loudly, but leaves an imprint that lingers long after the music fades. And though no one in that room could have known it yet, not even Daniel Hayes himself, the moment he chose her was the moment he lost control. Daniel Hayes allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to tighten every eye in the room around him, his fingers lightly tapping against the polished wood of his violin as if even the instrument itself understood it belonged to him. Then with a casual tilt of his head, he gestured toward Clara with a smile that never reached his eyes, a smile designed not to invite but to expose. And the audience followed his gaze like a single organism, turning toward the woman who had no place in their expectations, no role in their evening, no voice in their carefully curated world, and yet now stood at the center of it without having taken a single step. "You," he said, smoothly into the microphone, his tone wrapped in false warmth that carried an edge too sharp to ignore. "Why do not we make this evening a little more inclusive?" A few soft chuckles rippled through the crowd, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of laughter that masked discomfort with politeness. And Clara remained still, her hand resting lightly on the cart, her expression unchanged, as if she had heard tones like this before. Tones dressed as kindness but built on assumption. Daniel continued, stepping slightly forward, the spotlight catching the fine lines of his tailored suit. Music is for everyone. After all, is it not? He paused deliberately, letting the statement hang, inviting agreement, inviting the room to align with him. Why do not you join me up here? The invitation landed not as a request, but as a command disguised in courtesy, and for a moment, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her reaction, waiting for the inevitable refusal that would confirm everything they already believed about her. But Clara did not refuse. She did not speak. She simply looked at him, her eyes steady, unreadable, and then, slowly, she released her grip on the cart, the faint sound of its wheels settling into stillness echoing softly across the marble floor. A small sound, but in the quiet, it carried, marking a shift that no one could quite explain, and as she stepped forward, each movement measured, unhurried. The distance between her and the stage seemed to stretch longer than it was, not because of space, but because of expectation, because every step she took unraveled the illusion that she would simply disappear back into the background. And Daniel watched her approach with growing satisfaction, mistaking her composure for compliance, mistaking her silence for submission, the audience leaning forward, curiosity sharpening into anticipation, whispers threading through the air like thin strands of tension. Is this part of the show? Someone murmured. She does not look like she belongs here. Another voice followed, quieter but no less certain. And yet Clara continued, her shoes making the softest contact with the floor, her posture unchanged, her gaze never leaving the stage, as if she had already crossed this line long before tonight. And when she finally reached the steps, there was a brief pause, a fraction of a second where time seemed to hesitate, where even Daniel's confident expression flickered with something almost imperceptible. But he recovered quickly, extending the violin toward her with a theatrical flourish, the gesture drawing a few more polite laughs. Do not worry, he said lightly, his voice carrying just enough to ensure the room heard every word. Just play something simple. The word simple lingered, heavy with implication, and Clara accepted the instrument without a word, her fingers brushing against the polished surface with familiarity so subtle it went unnoticed, her other hand lifting the bow with the same quiet precision. And for the first time, something shifted in the air, not loud, not obvious, but present, like the moment before a storm breaks, when everything feels still, too still, and Daniel stepped back, giving her the stage as if he were granting a favor, as if control still belonged entirely to him. But control, like silence, has a way of slipping when it is least expected, and as Clara stood beneath the lights, the glow catching the calm in her eyes, the audience leaned in, ready to witness a mistake, ready to confirm their assumptions, unaware that they were about to witness something else entirely, something that could not be undone, something that would leave the room forever changed. And in that fragile, suspended moment, just before the first note, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, as if instinctively sensing that what came next would not belong to Daniel Hayes anymore. Clara Whitmore stood beneath the weight of the spotlight, the violin resting lightly in her left hand, the bow poised between her fingers with a stillness that felt almost unnatural in a room built on performance. And for a moment, nothing happened, not a sound, not a movement, just a silence so complete it pressed gently against every person in the audience, as if the hall itself had decided to wait. And Daniel Hayes watched from a few steps away, arms loosely folded, a faint smile lingering on his lips, confident that this pause would stretch into awkwardness, into hesitation, into the quiet collapse he had orchestrated. But Clara did not rush. She did not fill the silence. She allowed it to exist, allowed it to settle, because silence, when held correctly, was not emptiness, it was control. And then, without warning, her posture shifted ever so slightly, her chin lowering to meet the violin with a familiarity that did not belong to a beginner, her shoulders relaxed, her grip effortless, and something in the room changed, subtle, almost invisible, but undeniable, as if an unseen line had just been crossed, and before anyone could name that feeling, the first note emerged, clear, precise, and impossibly pure, cutting through the air like a beam of light, not loud, not forced, but exact, and it did not ask for attention, it commanded it. the sound resonating through the hall with a depth that silenced even the smallest movement. Conversations died mid-thought. Glasses paused halfway to lips, and Daniel's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, as his eyes narrowed, searching for the flaw that should have been there, the hesitation that should have followed. But it did not come, because Clara's second note followed seamlessly, then a third, each one building not in volume, but in precision, weaving together into a melody that felt both controlled and alive, her bow moving with quiet authority, her fingers gliding across the strings with the kind of ease that could not be learned in a moment, that could not be faked under pressure, and the audience felt it before they understood it. That subtle shift from amusement to attention, from expectation to uncertainty, and then, as the melody expanded, something deeper emerged, a complexity hidden beneath the surface, layers unfolding with each phrase, revealing not just skill, but mastery. The kind of mastery that reshaped the space around it, and the room, once filled with quiet judgment, began to transform, the air thickening with realization, because this was no longer a moment of entertainment, it was a moment of revelation, and Clara did not look at the audience, she did not acknowledge Daniel. Her eyes remained steady, focused not on proving anything, but on the music itself, as if everything else had already been decided, and with each passing second, the balance shifted further, the laughter that had lingered at the edges disappeared completely, replaced by a silence that felt heavier, more deliberate. The room went silent, not because it had to, but because it could not do anything else, and Daniel Hayes stood there, unmoving, his confidence unraveling not in a dramatic collapse, but in the quiet realization that he was no longer in control of the narrative, his presence fading into the background as Clara's performance took hold of the space, her movements fluid, intentional, each note placed with the precision of someone who had spent years mastering not just the instrument, but the moment itself, and somewhere in the audience, a shift completed, the kind of shift that cannot be undone, where perception breaks and something new takes its place. Because they were no longer watching a simple woman being mocked, they were witnessing something far more rare, something that demanded respect without ever asking for it. And as Clara's melody rose, steady and undeniable, the truth settled quietly across the hall, that this was never her humiliation, it was theirs. The melody did not simply continue, it evolved, expanding beyond expectation into something that felt deliberate, almost surgical in its precision, each phrase layered with intention as Clara Whitmore guided the sound through the hall, like she had done it 1,000 times before, her movements calm, economical, never exaggerated, never seeking attention, and yet every eye remained locked on her. Because the music refused to let go, it filled the space in a way that replaced everything else. Conversations, judgments, assumptions, all of it dissolved under the weight of something undeniably real. And Daniel Hayes felt it most of all, standing just a few feet away, yet somehow farther from the center than he had ever been, his fingers tightening slightly at his sides, the faint crease forming between his brows as he tried to understand what he was hearing, because this was not imitation, this was not luck, this was structure, discipline, interpretation, the kind that only came from years of mastery. And yet the woman in front of him did not match the narrative he had already written in his mind, and that contradiction began to press against him, subtle at first, then sharper with every passing second, as Clara shifted into a more complex passage, her bow accelerating with controlled intensity, her left hand moving effortlessly across the fingerboard, each note landing exactly where it needed to be, not a fraction early, not a fraction late, the phrasing deliberate, expressive, alive, and the audience felt it rising, that quiet swell of realization building into something they could no longer ignore, shoulders straightened, breath slowed, eyes widened not in shock, but in recognition, because what they were witnessing was not just skill, it was authority, the kind that does not need to be announced, the kind that simply exists and reshapes everything around it. And then came the moment that changed everything, a subtle shift in tempo, a transition so seamless most would miss it, but Daniel did not, his head tilting slightly as his expression hardened, because he recognized it, not just the technique, but the composition itself, a piece rarely performed, one that required not only technical perfection but deep interpretive understanding. A piece he had once claimed as part of his own repertoire, and yet the way Clara played it was different, more refined, more intentional, as if she understood something about it that others did not. And that realization struck him not with noise, but with silence, the kind that empties a room inside your own mind. Because suddenly, the foundation of his certainty began to shift, and the audience felt it too, though they could not name it, a tension threading through the air, not discomfort, but awareness. As if the performance had moved beyond entertainment into something closer to truth, and Clara remained unchanged within it, her focus unwavering, her expression calm, her presence grounded, as if she had already lived through this moment long before tonight, as if this stage, this crowd, this test, none of it was new to her. And as the music climbed toward its peak, her bow drawing out a final sequence of notes that carried both power and restraint, the room leaned in collectively, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, something closer to respect. And when the final note rang out, clear and resonant, it did not end abruptly. It lingered, echoing softly against the high ceilings, settling into the silence that followed, a silence that no longer belonged to judgment, but to recognition. And no one moved, no one spoke, because something had shifted too completely to be undone. And in that suspended moment, Daniel Hayes understood what the rest of the room was only beginning to feel, that this had never been his stage to control, not tonight, not in this moment, because the narrative had changed, and it had changed without asking his permission. The final note lingered in the air like a breath that no one dared to release, its resonance stretching across the grand hall until even the faintest echo dissolved into a silence, so complete it felt almost sacred. And for a moment, time itself seemed to hesitate, as if the room needed permission to move forward, but no one gave it, because no one wanted to be the first to break what had just been created. And Clara Whitmore lowered the bow slowly, her movements unhurried, deliberate, the violin still resting beneath her chin as if the music had not fully left her yet, her expression unchanged, calm, composed, untouched by the weight of what had just unfolded, as though she had simply completed something expected, something ordinary, even as the world around her struggled to catch up. And Daniel Hayes stood frozen a few feet away, his posture rigid, his carefully constructed confidence unraveling not in a dramatic collapse, but in the quiet absence of control, his eyes fixed on Clara with a mixture of disbelief and recognition that he could not fully suppress, because what he had just witnessed did not fit into the narrative he had built. It did not align with the assumptions he had made, and that contradiction pressed against him, demanding an explanation he was not prepared to give. And then, somewhere in the audience, a single sound broke through, the sharp, unmistakable clap of hands, hesitant at first, almost uncertain, but it did not remain alone for long, because recognition, once it begins, rarely stays contained. And another clap followed, then another, until the silence fractured completely, replaced by a wave of applause that rose not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something earned, the kind of response that cannot be forced, that cannot be manufactured. And the room, once so certain of its judgments, now stood in quiet surrender to a truth it could no longer deny. People rising from their seats, not all at once, but in a steady ripple that moved through the crowd, a standing ovation forming without instruction, without coordination, driven by something instinctive, something undeniable. And Clara finally lowered the violin from her shoulder, her fingers releasing the instrument with the same quiet precision she had held it, her gaze lifting just slightly, not to seek approval, but to acknowledge the moment, her eyes sweeping across the audience with a calm that did not ask for validation, because she had never needed it. And Daniel felt it then, fully, the shift he could no longer ignore, the realization settling into place with a clarity that left no room for denial, because the piece she had played, the interpretation she had delivered, it was not just familiar, it was definitive. It carried nuances he had studied, passages he had performed, but never quite understood the way she had just revealed them. And that truth settled heavily, not as an accusation, but as a quiet exposure. And he opened his mouth slightly, as if to speak, as if to reclaim something, anything, but no words came, because there was nothing left to say that would restore what had been lost, and Clara turned slightly toward him, extending the violin back with a simple, respectful gesture. Her hand steady, her expression neutral, offering no challenge, no triumph. Just completion, and that gesture, more than anything else, sealed the moment, because it made clear that she had never stepped onto that stage to prove herself. She had simply responded to what had been placed before her, and now, she was done, and as Daniel accepted the instrument, his fingers brushing against hers for the briefest second, he felt the final piece fall into place, the understanding that control, once assumed, can vanish in an instant when confronted by something real, and the applause continued, filling the hall with a sound that no longer belonged to him, a sound that had shifted entirely, and in that moment, under the glow of the chandeliers and the weight of 100 watching eyes, the truth stood quietly between them, undeniable and complete, that respect is not given by position, and it is never earned through mockery. It is revealed, in moments like this, when everything else falls silent. The applause did not fade quickly. It lingered, swelling and echoing against the high ceilings as if the room itself refused to let the moment end. But beneath that sound, something quieter was taking shape, something more permanent, because admiration may rise in an instant, but respect settles slowly, and Clara Whitmore stood at the center of it without claiming any of it, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as though she had already stepped beyond the need for recognition, and that was what unsettled the room the most. Not just what she had done, but how little she seemed to require in return, and as the applause gradually softened into a sustained murmur of voices and shifting movements, people began to look at one another, searching for confirmation, for shared understanding, because something had clearly been revealed, but not everyone yet knew what it meant. And Daniel Hayes felt that uncertainty closing in around him, subtle but undeniable, the eyes that had once admired him now flickering with something else, curiosity, doubt, comparison, and he could feel the shift in their attention, the way it moved away from him without announcement, without apology, and settled instead on the woman who had just returned his instrument without a single word of triumph. And he inhaled slowly, steadying himself, forcing his posture back into place, because men like him did not collapse in public. They recalibrated, they adapted, they reclaimed, and he stepped forward, raising a hand slightly to quiet the remaining applause, his voice returning to the microphone with practiced control, smooth, composed, almost unchanged. Well, he began, a faint smile returning to his lips, though it did not quite reach his eyes this time. It seems we have been given an unexpected performance tonight. A few polite chuckles surfaced, hesitant, uncertain, as if the audience was unsure how to respond now, unsure of where the line between admiration and discomfort lay, and Daniel turned toward Clara, his gaze measured, studying her more carefully now, no longer dismissive, no longer certain. "You play remarkably well," he continued, the compliment offered with precision, controlled, deliberate, as though he were placing it carefully into the space between them. "Where did you learn?" The question hung in the air, simple on the surface, but carrying weight beneath it, because it was no longer about curiosity. It was about explanation, about restoring order to something that had slipped beyond his understanding. And Clara met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, her voice quiet when she finally spoke, yet carrying clearly across the hall without effort. "A long time ago," she said, and nothing more, no elaboration, no justification, just a statement that closed the door as gently as it opened it, and the room absorbed that answer, or rather, the absence within it, because it offered no comfort, no easy narrative to return to, and Daniel felt it again, that subtle loss of control, the realization that whatever story he had hoped to reconstruct, she was not going to participate in it, and for a moment, he hesitated, searching for a way forward, for a way to reposition himself, to regain the balance that had shifted so quietly yet so completely, but the audience had already begun to move beyond him, their attention drifting back to Clara, their expressions changing, not just impressed, but curious now, genuinely curious, the kind that does not fade easily. And somewhere near the front row, an older man leaned toward his companion, whispering something that caused her eyes to widen slightly, a recognition passing. between them that spread outward in subtle waves, as if pieces of a puzzle were beginning to align in the background, unnoticed by most, but not by everyone. And Clara remained where she was, unhurried, untouched by the shifting currents around her, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her presence grounded in a way that suggested she had nothing left to prove, because the truth, once revealed, does not need repetition. And as the murmurs grew slightly louder, as names and fragments of memory began to surface among those who had seen, who had heard, who had remembered something they could not yet fully place, the atmosphere changed again, not dramatically, but unmistakably, and Daniel Hayes, standing under the same lights that had once defined him, realized that this moment was no longer his to control, because something far greater than performance had entered the room, something that could not be directed, could not be shaped, could only be recognized, and whether he was ready or not, that recognition had already begun. The murmurs did not remain scattered for long. They began to connect, forming quiet threads of recognition that moved through the audience with increasing certainty, subtle at first, then unmistakable, as names were whispered, comparisons drawn, memories resurfacing from years that had long since passed. And near the front row, the older man who had leaned in moments earlier straightened slowly, his expression no longer curious, but certain, his eyes fixed on Clara Whitmore with a clarity that cut through the lingering uncertainty in the room. "It cannot be," he whispered, though the conviction in his voice suggested otherwise, and the woman beside him followed his gaze, her lips parting slightly as realization dawned, not sudden, but steady, like a truth finally stepping out of the shadows. And that recognition did not stay contained. It moved outward, carried in hushed voices and exchanged glances, each confirmation strengthening the next, until the room itself seemed to shift once more, not in confusion this time, but in awareness. And Daniel Hayes felt it before he fully understood it, the way attention sharpened, the way curiosity deepened into something far more focused, far more specific, and he watched as the older man rose from his seat, not hurried, not dramatic, but deliberate, the kind of movement that draws attention without asking for it. And as he turned slightly toward the stage, his voice carried just enough to reach beyond his immediate circle. "Clara Whitmore," he said, clearly now, no longer a question, but a statement. And the name settled into the air with weight, as if it belonged there, as if it had been waiting to return, and for a brief moment, nothing followed. Just silence, the kind that listens, the kind that waits. And then, like a ripple breaking across still water, the reaction came, subtle gasps, widened eyes, the quiet shift of posture as people began to place the name, to connect it with something distant yet familiar, something they had heard before, read about, perhaps even admired without realizing they were now standing in its presence. And Daniel felt it fully then. The ground beneath his certainty giving way, not violently, but completely, because the name was not unfamiliar to him. It lived somewhere in the back of his mind, buried beneath years of performances, reviews, and carefully curated narratives. But now, hearing it spoken aloud, connected to the woman standing beside him, it rose with undeniable clarity, and with it came something far less comfortable, memory, not just of the name, but of the music, of interpretations that had once set a standard he had quietly studied, quietly adapted, quietly claimed. And his gaze shifted back to Clara, searching her face for confirmation, for denial, for anything that would disrupt the alignment of truth now forming around him. But she offered none, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as if the name held no more weight for her than the silence that had preceded it. And that calm unsettled him more than any reaction could have, because it suggested something far greater than recognition. It suggested certainty, and the audience felt it too, the shift from admiration to reverence, from curiosity to understanding, because this was no longer a question of whether she was skilled, that had already been answered. This was about who she was, and what that meant for everything they had just witnessed. And as more voices quietly repeated her name, as the pieces fell into place across the room, the narrative transformed completely, no longer centered on Daniel Hayes, no longer driven by his control, but anchored instead in the quiet presence of a woman who had never needed to claim her place because it had always been hers. And Daniel stood there, under the same lights that had once elevated him, now feeling their weight in a way he had never experienced before, not as a spotlight, but as exposure, because in the absence of noise, in the clarity of recognition, the truth does not arrive loudly. It settles, steady and undeniable, and in that moment, surrounded by a room that was no longer looking at him the same way, he understood something he had never truly considered before. That respect built on assumption can vanish in an instant, but respect rooted in truth does not need to be defended. It simply returns, and Clara Whitmore had just taken hers back without ever asking for it. The name did not fade. It settled deeper, echoing through the minds of those who recognized it and pulling the rest along in its wake. Because once spoken with certainty, truth has a way of expanding beyond the moment, and Clara Whitmore stood unchanged at the center of it, her presence steady, untouched by the shifting energy around her, while the audience leaned into this new understanding, their earlier assumptions dissolving completely, replaced by something far more profound. And Daniel Hayes felt that transformation with a clarity that left no room for denial, the weight of recognition pressing against him as the fragments of memory aligned, not just the name, but the legacy attached to it, the recordings he had once studied, the interpretations critics had called untouchable, the quiet disappearance that had left a void in the world of classical music years ago, a void many had tried to fill, himself included. And now, standing beside her, that absence was no longer abstract. It was present, undeniable, and far more powerful than anything he had constructed in her absence. And, for the first time that evening, his composure did not return as easily as before, his gaze lowering briefly, not in defeat, but in recognition of something larger than his own narrative, something that could not be redirected or reframed, because it did not belong to him. And the audience felt it too, that subtle shift from discovery to consequence, as the meaning of what had just occurred began to settle. Because this was no longer just about a remarkable performance, it was about context, about history, about the quiet revelation that the woman they had overlooked had once stood at the very top of the world they admired, and had stepped away without explanation, without spectacle, leaving behind only the echo of her mastery. And now, without announcement, she had returned, not to reclaim attention, but simply by existing within it, and the realization carried weight, not loud, not chaotic, but heavy, deliberate, reshaping the atmosphere of the room with a quiet authority that no one dared to challenge. And somewhere in the audience, a voice spoke again, softer this time, almost reverent. She disappeared, the words drifting just enough to be heard, not as gossip, but as acknowledgement, and others nodded subtly, recalling headlines, speculation, the unanswered questions that had followed her absence. And yet Clara offered no explanation, no confirmation. She did not engage with the narrative forming around her, because she did not need to. Her silence now carried more meaning than any statement could provide, and that silence extended across the stage, settling between her and Daniel in a way that could not be ignored, because where once there had been imbalance, assumption, control, now there was only clarity, and Daniel understood it fully, not through confrontation, but through contrast, the realization that everything he had built, every performance, every interpretation, had been measured, whether he admitted it or not, against a standard that now stood quietly before him, unchanged, unchallenged, and beyond his reach. And for a moment, he considered speaking again, reclaiming the stage with something rehearsed, something safe, but the instinct faded as quickly as it came, because there was nothing left to reclaim. The room no longer belonged to performance. It belonged to truth, and truth does not respond to control. It simply remains. And Clara shifted her weight slightly, a small movement that drew attention without effort, her gaze lifting once more across the audience, not seeking validation, but acknowledging their presence with a calm that felt both distant and deeply grounded. And in that moment, something settled across the room. Completely, the final piece of understanding, because this was not a return driven by ambition. It was not a performance meant to impress. It was something quieter, something far more powerful, the simple act of presence, of allowing truth to exist without explanation. And as the room absorbed that, as the whispers faded into a deeper, more respectful silence, The imbalance that had defined the beginning of the evening disappeared entirely, replaced by something far more enduring, because in the absence of noise, in the clarity of recognition, the truth does not demand attention, it commands it, and Clara Whitmore, without raising her voice, without changing her expression, had just reminded everyone in that room exactly what that truth looked like. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was complete, settled, almost reverent, as if the room itself had finally understood what it had been given and chosen, collectively, not to disturb it, and Clara Whitmore stood within that stillness without claiming it, without shaping it, simply allowing it to exist, her presence unchanged from the moment she first stepped forward, and that, more than anything else, defined the end of the night, not applause, not recognition, but restraint, the kind that only appears when truth has already spoken for itself. And Daniel Hayes remained where he was. The weight of the moment no longer something he could redirect or reinterpret, because there was nothing left to manage, nothing left to perform, only something to accept, and acceptance, for someone who had always controlled the narrative, arrived quietly, almost reluctantly, his gaze lifting once more toward Clara, not with the confidence he had worn before, but with something far more grounded, something closer to understanding. And though no words passed between them, the distance that had once separated their positions had dissolved completely, replaced by a clarity that required no explanation, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Clara stepped back from the center of the stage, not retreating, not withdrawing, simply moving with the same calm intention that had guided her every action that evening, her path leading her away from the spotlight without hesitation, without pause, as if she had never intended to remain there. And the audience watched, not with confusion this time, but with a quiet awareness, understanding that what they had witnessed was not meant to be extended, not meant to be repeated. It was complete as it was, and as she reached the edge of the stage, her hand briefly resting on the handle of the cart she had left behind, the smallest detail returning to its place, the simplest image, reasserting itself, a reminder of where she had been seen at the beginning. And yet nothing about that image held the same meaning anymore, because the room had changed, and so had their understanding of her, and Clara did not look back. She did not wait for acknowledgement. She simply resumed her quiet role with the same composure she had always carried, her steps measured, her presence steady, as if the extraordinary had never interrupted the ordinary, and perhaps, for her, it had not, and the audience remained still for a moment longer, watching her move through the space with a respect that had not existed before, a respect that no longer needed to be expressed loudly, because it had already taken root. And Daniel Hayes lowered his gaze briefly, exhaling a breath he had not realized he had been holding, the final shift settling into place within him, not as defeat, but as recognition, the kind that changes something fundamental, the kind that does not fade once the lights go out. And as the hall slowly began to return to motion, as voices resumed and people shifted in their seats, the atmosphere did not return to what it had been. It could not, because something essential had been revealed, something that would remain long after the evening ended. And though the stage lights still shone, though the program would continue, though performances would follow, none of it would carry the same weight as what had already occurred, because moments like this do not compete, they conclude. And as Clara Whitmore disappeared once more into the quiet edges of the room, no longer unseen, no longer overlooked, the truth of the night remained clear, not spoken, not announced, but understood, that dignity does not demand attention. It reveals itself in the moment it is tested, and when it does, the world, even for just a second, remembers exactly what it looks like.